It's great that this conference is hybrid, so I was able to join you from my bedroom. So I'm excited to share some of my research on employee responses to social and environmental initiatives and communications with you all. This is very much what the focus of my research is on. And I'm really excited to hear that there was interest in sort of this issue that's come up earlier in the conference. So by way of motivation, I think we would all agree that understanding how employees respond to different company policies in terms of recruitment, motivation, retention is key. Now, to study this effectively, sort of from an academic research perspective, a couple things. One, I would say it's important to observe actual employee behavior rather than just surveying your employees about how they would sort of respond hypothetically to different things, because individuals often don't behave as they say they would, or perhaps even think they would, especially if you're asking them something directly about like a social issue that they may feel they're supposed to respond to in some way. It's also important to try to identify a causal relationship between companies' sort of social environmental initiatives and communications and employee outcomes. And this is often challenging because of so many different things that could be driving both of these things. So experimental designs, field experimental designs in research can sort of be useful to help address this. And so the research that I'll be sharing with you today does just that. It uses experimental design, similar to sort of A/B testing that we might think about in firms, and utilizes sort of observed actual employee behavior in different contexts. Now, when we think about corporate climate initiatives and communications, I think what's sort of interesting about climate-related initiatives in particular is that they could conceptually be considered to fall into either one of these two buckets. You might consider them as part of sort of corporate social responsibility, which has been defined as firm practices, policies, and behavior, which benefits society or the environment beyond what companies are legally required to do. It also could potentially fall under the category of what researchers are calling sort of corporate or CEO social and political activism, where firms or their leaders communicate on stances on sort of social political issues that are not directly related to their core business. So this includes things like LGBTQ rights, immigration, and climate change has sometimes also been lumped into this category as well. And so, thinking about how these different types of things influence firm benefiting employee behavior, what's interesting is that, so I've focused my research exactly on this, and essentially I've found that there tends to be a positive relationship between CSR initiatives and employee behavior, but there's actually a negative relationship between how taking stances on these types of issues influences firm benefiting employee behavior. And then I've also studied sort of the contingencies that helped explain these things. So let me start with some just sort of high level of some of my research, which has looked at this relationship, how corporate social responsibility influences employees. So in this paper, this is a paper that was implemented, a field experiment on Elance, which is now Upwork. This is an online labor marketplaces that matches employers to workers doing short-term jobs. And I randomly assigned whether actual hired workers were told about their employing company's social responsibility or not. And then I observed the amount that they bid for payment for the job. And what I found is that those who were informed about the company's social and environmental responsibility were willing to accept lower wages. And this was actually driven by the highest performing workers. And it's interesting because I think it suggests that these prospective employees, especially high-performing ones, value this. And the mechanism that I found is it's because they view how the company treats others, the community, and the environment as an indication of how they are likely to treat them as employees. For a separate paper, my co-author and I conducted a field experiment in a bank in Latin America, where all new joining employees to the firm were randomly assigned to either participate in a company organized social initiative mentoring low-income children in the area for half a day or not, as part of their sort of employee onboarding process. And then we tracked these employees over the course of the next year. And somewhat remarkably, we found that this half-day social impact initiative reduced the likelihood that employees left the firm 1 year later by quite a significant amount, as well as their self-reported levels of stress at work. So what about how social political activism might affect employee behavior? So in this paper, I looked exactly at this issue, and I wanted to understand how communicating a stance, either for or against an issue, might influence employee motivation. And what I expected to find is that if employees agree with the stance, they'll be more motivated, and if they disagree with the stance, they will be less motivated. That wasn't exactly what I found. Instead, what I found was evidence of a demotivating effect if employees disagree with the stance, but no evidence of a motivating effect if employees agreed with the stance. So regardless of whether the employee is against the issue and the company is also against the issue, you can see that compared to the control group, they're sort of statistically equivalent. But if the company took a stance in agreement with the issue and the employee disagreed, you see quite a significant sort of drop in motivation here, and a parallel result, even if with sort of the opposing stance on the issue. And so this suggests that there are potential risks to firms who communicate stances on these types of issues from a human capital management perspective. So in terms of contingencies affecting these relationships, I've also been really interested in examining how different company policies or characteristics might influence whether we're more or less likely to see these types of benefits from a human capital management perspective. And I'll just share sort of two high-level findings from a couple of papers looking at that. In one paper, my co-author and I discovered that communication about a company's CSR efforts or an internal ethics code, we sort of saw similar effects here, reduced gig and remote worker misconduct on the job. So we conducted an experiment. We were able to sort of actually observe whether or not these employees were engaging in misconduct and misreporting things on the job to their firm. It reduced misconduct only if the employer was not monitoring its workers. When the workers were aware that they were also being monitored, this sort of eliminated any benefits that we would have seen from the CSR initiative in terms of how it reduced misconduct. And then the mechanism that we see evidence for is that what's happened is that when you're monitoring your workers feel like you don't trust them. And that perception of trust is really critical to getting any of these sort of CSR environmental initiative types of benefits from a human capital management perspective. In another paper, my co-author and I find that communication about CSR initiatives, both in the form of sort of community or environmental CSR, as well as diversity initiatives, increases prospective worker interest in a job at a startup company if the founders of the company were female, but actually decreased prospective interest if the founders were male. And the mechanism that we found to be at play here is that, CSR is often considered to be sort of a stereotypically female rather than male typed construct. Communality, caring for others, the environment, et cetera, is sort of more considered a stereotypical female than male characteristic. And individuals, including job seekers, often prefer sort of what we call gender congruence or consistency in organizational characteristics. So those were some of the highlights of my existing work to date on these topics. And I'll mention that with the support of the Tamer Center, I'm excited to build on this in the future. And I'll be looking specifically at how sort of corporate climate initiatives and communications specifically influence some of these employee outcomes, as well as what the contingencies and mechanisms are that are driving these effects. And I think one thing that I anticipate to be really important here, given my existing sort of related work, is whether or not employees view the issue of sort of climate initiatives and communications as a social political issue versus more in this category of responsibility, just general sort of social responsibility, because my existing research suggests that we get very different effects from an employee motivation perspective with these sort of two different characteristics. So that's all that I have to share with you today. Thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to connecting and any questions you might have.
As Vanessa indicated, we've got a minute or so for questions. If there are any questions you'd like to pose to her. Okay, in that case, I guess we'll move on to the next speaker, Luisa Palacios. Luisa is here in person, and I have to say we're deeply grateful to Luisa. She stepped in to replace somebody else who was sufficiently ill with COVID that they couldn't even present from home. And she agreed to do this yesterday. So she's had all of 24 hours to prepare for this, so thank you so much. Luisa is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. Before joining Columbia, she had a distinguished career in both the oil industry and in the finance field. She's done many very interesting jobs there, but amongst those was she was chair of the board of Citgo, which is one of the largest refiners, oil refiners here in the US during a particularly difficult period in that period. So Luisa, let me hand over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Columbia Business School and to the Climate School for organizing this event. And thank you, Professor Heal, for inviting me, even if it's a substitute. It gives me a chance to talk about an industry that normally doesn't get too much discussed in climate events. So I'm thrilled to be here to talk about the oil and gas business. But it's not only the oil and gas business that I want to talk about. It is actually the most difficult and complex part of the oil and gas business, which is the national oil companies. And I feel strongly about this. I've spent most of my career in the emerging market space. And so I'm used to distressed assets, to crisis management, and thinking about climate. I cannot think of a more difficult place to be, but also one of the most important places to be in order for the world to reach its climate goals. So I want to be here answering the question, why should we all care about why national companies' performance on the ESG space? Next slide. Oh, I have this here. Oh, maybe the keyboard. No. Oh, now. Oh, sorry. So I'm going to give you actually 4 reasons, but I put 3 there. The first one is that national companies have a dominant presence in the oil production, in refining production, in gas production. And it's, as I started in the introduction, it's going to be very difficult to achieve climate goals if we do not get them on board. To give you an idea of their relevance is that they represent 50% of all the oil production in the world, and most likely this share is going to increase. They already represent 56% of the global refining capacity in the world, and they are everywhere. So it's I've looked at how many national companies there is. There are about 70 national oil companies worldwide. And yes, they issue bonds and they are in the stock markets, and the oil that is controlled by listed national companies is about the size of OPEC alone. So these are things that are relevant. One of the things that the EIA has been very clear on saying is that to minimize global greenhouse emissions from core oil and gas operations should be the first order of priority, because there's a carbon budget and there is oil and gas production being produced right now. So anything that we can do to decarbonize oil and gas production currently is going to help significantly in order to meet our climate goals. The other thing is that the fossil fuel operations generate about 1/3 of all methane emissions. So among the greenhouse gases, yes, carbon dioxide, the oil and gas industry, the upstream part of the oil and gas industry represent about 50% of all carbon emissions, but they do represent 1/3 of methane emissions, and methane is more damaging to the environment. So anything that we can do to reduce methane emissions is extremely relevant. One of the things of how methane emissions in the oil and gas operation business work is that leaks and flaring are pretty much responsible for these kinds of methane emissions in the planet. And so the World Bank has stepped in this initiative, which is a zero gas flaring initiative, which is one of the things that you can do to reduce greenhouse emissions. And one of the things that they have found is that of the 7 countries that are the most gas flaring countries in the planet, Except for the US, everyone else has national companies that have a monopoly position, or if not, a completely dominant position in the oil sector. So that's part of why the World Bank and other international organizations have to engage with national companies in order to reduce that. So the other thing of why ESG matters for national oil companies is because, to me, it represents a huge credit risk. When I look at, and having been exposed to emerging markets and debt and equity, most of the emerging market space, the way you are exposed to both bonds and equity depends on the market capitalization of equity issuance and market capitalization of bond issuance. So when I look at the benchmark indices that emerging market funds have to follow, what I see is that you're either directly exposed to oil and gas operations for national companies, or you are indirectly exposed. Because right now, and this is not the ESG one, this is the normal one that represents the market capitalization, you are pretty much the EMBI plus means that the 50% of the issuance that exists, the stock of issuance that exists in emerging markets is either national companies or the oil exporting countries, or the governments of the oil exporting countries. So you're highly exposed to this. So from a credit perspective, from a developmental perspective, this matters. And so it matters that the ESG performance of national companies and their shareholders. The other thing of why it matters is because in the discussion about why the oil and gas sector has to navigate the energy transition, we talk about stranded assets and how that affects valuations. To me, the way I look at this is that I not only look at stranded assets, I look at stranded companies, stranded countries, and what that can do for credit and for developmental purposes. The other reason, so I've talked about the costs so far of national companies not navigating the energy transition. I now want to talk about the opportunities. I don't want to stress this too much because I know the realities of national companies in emerging markets, but I generally believe that part of the very difficult equation of financing the energy transition has to have national companies on board. In part because it is my experience with emerging markets that the national companies are the ones that have the balance sheet to be able to finance these kinds of investments and have, relatively speaking, the infrastructure capacity, capital development capacity, project management capacity. However deficient that could be is within all of these countries. These are really the largest companies, sometimes the largest companies in their stock market, largest bond issuers. And I've been tracking how the national companies are navigating the energy transition. And why I think it's relevant to bring the ESG into the equation is because I found a correlation between the level of access of national companies, both to the international financial markets or either as bonds or through issuance of stock, as it relates to the level of ESG disclosures. Access to finance is one of the most important drivers of why national companies have had to pretty much get in line and start to issue ESG reports, be transparent on ESG metrics. And when you have to issue ESG reports and start to report on ESG metrics, then you have to care about scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions. And what I found is that looking at the strategies of both the international companies and national companies in their efforts to decarbonize is that they invest, for example, on the upstream side, in order to extract oil and gas, one of the things that they're investing is in CCUS technologies. That is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The EIA and every single organization has stressed the importance of investing in this type of technologies in order to reduce carbon emissions and in our path to net zero. And what I've seen, for example, is that a country like Brazil, particularly national company Petrobras, is currently operating the largest CCUS project. It is, yes, an enhanced oil recovery project, which means that from the point of view of climate, that might not be ideal because what it is allowing is still production of oil. But what you want is for every single oil barrel that you consume to be as decarbonized as possible. So what I'm seeing is that In the process of decarbonizing and the strategies of decarbonizing, some of these companies are actually putting some of their petrodollars and using their balance sheet, even if that means an increase in their cost of production, in order to decarbonize their own barrels, because some of them are looking at this more in the long end. Or we want to be the last man standing. And so in order to be the last man standing, you actually need to prove, and they understand that they need to prove that their oil or their barrel is the most decarbonized possible. So I'm seeing some of the national companies be sensitive to this. A world of net zero is not a world where there's zero oil production or zero gas, natural gas, just to be clear. At least for the time being, that's what the international organizations are saying. So what you want is that even if it's not 100 million barrels per day that we're producing, for 25, you want that 25 to be net zero. And so these things are important, and we should care about them. I have 3 examples of deployment of CCUS. I'm also going to show you examples of how national companies are dealing with scope 2 emissions. In emerging markets, the oil and gas industry tends to be, if not the largest consumer of electricity, among the largest consumers of electricity. The strategies that oil and gas companies are doing, both in developed markets and in emerging markets, in order to do scope 2 emissions, is that they're reducing all the inputs or the services that they use in order to produce oil and gas. That means trying to decarbonize through electricity production. So they're putting their balance sheet to motivate either produce themselves or just buy their electricity from renewable sources. So what I see is a company like ADNOC, which is the United Arab Emirates national company, that has pledged that all of its electricity is going to be in time. They're already very high, but they have a goal of 100% renewable electricity in their production. And the same for Argentina's YPF. They have actually decided to go into that space. They have a separate company called YPF Luz, and they're now responsible for 3 wind farms in Argentina. I'm going to also give the example of Colombia Ecopetrol, because the electricity part, we kind of have that figure out in terms of how we're going to deploy clean energy technologies, not only in developed space, but in the developing world. I'm just going to give you an example. Latin America has one of the greenest electricity grid matrices, and they already are at 70 or 60% of renewable electricity in their electricity grid. So Latin America is an example of a region that already is where everyone else wants to be. So we know how to do that in emerging markets. What we don't know how to do is the transportation sector. Electric vehicles is a difficult proposition. So I'm gonna, one of the things that I've been tracking is how national companies, what kind of hydrogen strategy are they gonna have? Because that is how most of us believe that the transportation sector is gonna end up decarbonizing. And so, for example, Colombia's Ecopetrol has just started a pilot project of green hydrogen for its refinery. Let me just touch upon refineries. Refineries are right now the largest consumers of hydrogen. In establishing, one of the difficulties in emerging markets in the energy transition is establishing markets that do not exist. And so if refineries are right now the most important consumers of hydrogen, getting refineries to start that market and to use their balance sheets, to start doing green hydrogen is again a way in which you have a learning process within emerging markets that allows them to navigate the energy transition. So again, I don't want to push this because I look at the capex of all these national companies, as most of the capex is really going to just normal oil and gas production. But I think it's a significant area of opportunity because the International Energy Agency has been very clear that the extent of the challenge in emerging markets so that they can reach their climate goals is about $1 trillion of investments annually. Well, we are way below this, and so we need every dollar that we can get in order to achieve those goals. Lastly, one of the things that I also look in my research is that in order to understand ESG in emerging markets and ESG in national companies, I'm also looking at the ESG industry and the ESG rating industry. And I've looked at, okay, how is the ESG industry looking at national companies versus international companies to understand where are they in how we evaluate their performance. I'm not going to get into too much of the details of this, but this conference is about net zero, right? So it's about really climate. In emerging markets, I cannot stress enough the importance of the S and the G in order also to get the E right. So one of the spillover effects of having national companies navigate the ESG framework is that in order for them to get the E right, they're also being asked to show their metrics on S and G. And if anyone here follows emerging markets, you should know that governance is one of the most difficult issues to do. And if the Russia-Ukraine crisis has done something, is to underscore the relevance of G in emerging markets. And the relevance of G in emerging markets is that we should care who the shareholder is. We should care what they do with the money they receive. We should care how board members are appointed. We should care what the internal controls of national companies look like. We should care about corruption practices. We should care about all of these things. And so when although the national companies are navigating the ESG space because of access of financing, and they have to show their performance on the environmental front, and that's what really the financial sector cares most. I think that the framework also tells you that ESG is an evaluation of a company at a specific point in time. What is relevant is the pathway. What is relevant is the travel. And you're not going to get there unless you have particularly the G correct. Because right now, and one of the most striking things that I realize is that on the E front, there's not a lot of difference right now between international companies and national companies. Why? Why is that? There could be many reasons, including how they evaluate E. But there's one reason as well that has to do with the resource endowment of the national companies. National companies are actually sitting right now on the lowest carbon emission resources, which is why the EIA has mentioned that in the net zero world, most likely, most of the oil is going to come from the Middle East. And so I think today's crisis has highlighted that it's not only E that you should care about, it's S and G, and therefore is that a world that we want. And so in order for everyone else to be able to navigate that energy transition, the G has to be right, because that's the way you are going to push forward for those goals. Sorry that I was a little bit too long. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Luisa. Final speaker is Shiva Rajgopal. Some of you probably remember, he's a professor in the accounting division here, and he will be beamed in remotely, we hope, instantaneously.
Can you hear me, Jeff?
I can hear you, yes. Now you're visible on one screen. I can see you on the lower screen down here, but yeah, okay, great. You're off, Shiva.
Okay, thank you so much. So the previous talk kind of nicely sets up what I was going to talk about. So just by way of a quick 30-second introduction, my name is Shiva Rajgopal, and I work on ESG measurement, reporting, assurance. How does that information get priced, if it does, with capital markets, and loosely say climate finance, green bonds, that kind of stuff. So the introduction was just a lengthy excuse to make sure that you can actually look at this cartoon in the Financial Times, and maybe you cannot, but I love this cartoon. So what about, so this is a joint work with three of my fellow collaborators, Hemang Desai, Pauline Lam, and Bin Lee. This project was generously funded by the Tamer Center, and thanks to Jeff, Bruce, and Dean Costis-Maglaris for actually funding this, because without the funding, we couldn't have done what we've done. So the project aims to look at carbon reduction pledges in US oil and gas companies. So the previous speaker, I think, has kind of set this up quite well for us. So what are we trying to do? So let me just flash a couple of slides to motivate the idea. There's tons of investor interest, as you know, in companies cutting carbon emissions. So this is an extract from the 510-page SEC climate new rules that were just put out, and I've actually read the 510 pages. I'm not sure how much I retained. I retained a little bit, but the reason I put this up is look at this footnote 38 and 39. And the idea being, there is, I've never seen this much investor enthusiasm for anything. And I'm an accounting professor by trade. I'm almost envious that people are pushing so hard for climate reporting, and they, not sure they have the same enthusiasm for worrying about financial reporting. But the numbers are undeniable. I mean, look at this, like BlackRock, 9 trillion, Council of Institutional Investors, 4, PIMCO, 45 trill, State Street, 4, Vanguard, 7 trill. They're all pushing for some kind of consistency and comparability in climate disclosures, especially because investors are struggling to figure out what does a net zero pledge mean, what does a pledge to reduce carbon mean, and that's part of the exercise that we undertake in this project. So and there are tons of headlines. I'm sure if you're in this room, you already know about this. So let me go to the 4 research questions that we were looking at. So the first research question, what kind of firms, and to be clear, we look at the E&P space, which basically means exploration and production. So these are upstream oil companies, and we are specifically only looking at US companies. We are not looking at Canadian, Australian, Middle East. More important, we're not looking at the state-owned enterprises, which as the previous speaker mentioned, are hugely important. And I often tell people, even if we shut down all the Western oil majors, the oil will still come from Aramco and Iran, Venezuela, and so on. So it's kind of important to understand those, but that's not what we're looking at here. These are just US listed public companies, again, not private. That's another issue that we can talk about, because the worry is that some of the brown washing, these assets end up with private equity and they're off the radar and so on. 3 sets of companies here, 3 small subsamples, companies that have actually announced net zero, companies that have pledged some kind of reduction in carbon, and companies that have done nothing. So the first idea is just to understand who does what, and at least from a correlation standpoint, understand what those characteristics of these companies might be. The second question, are these pledges credible? That's an incredibly difficult question to go after, but our humble attempt at addressing that is to check if there is a stock price reaction. And the thinking here being, if the stock market thinks that this is cheap talk, you shouldn't see anything. If the stock market believes it's good somehow for these companies, and we can talk about what that good might be, you should see a positive reaction. And if the stock market thinks that maybe the costs are overwhelming, etc., then maybe you'll find a negative reaction to these pledges. Quality of pledges, this is where we spent an enormous amount of time trying to figure this out. It's very difficult. I've kind of vocally argued in favor of the SEC's new climate risk disclosures, and my perspective was highly informed by this project. So people who complain about the SEC's proposal, I mean, I would request you to go find 50 companies and try to figure out the state of current disclosures. In our experience, the information scattered all over the place. There's something in a proxy statement, something in a 10K, something in a sustainability report, something in a press release, something on a website. Sometimes they contradict each other. It's hard to figure out how to go about assessing quality, and we've made an attempt, and we can discuss that. But the plug here from a policy standpoint being, yes, you can object to the SEC proposals on several issues, but as an investor, I think it's undeniable that if everything gets put in one place and it is somewhat reasonably consistent and comparable, it'll make at least my life as an investor or a user or a consumer of financial statements a little bit easier in trying to assess, do these pledges really mean something, or is this just cheap talk? And finally, we would be remiss if we did not talk about the role of engine number one in this space. For folks who are not familiar with this, engine number one is a small hedge fund that came out of nowhere in December 2021, I think. They bought 0.02% of Exxon stock, spent a lot of their budget on publicity, and effectively managed to install 3 climate-friendly directors on Exxon's board, partly because BlackRock and Vanguard voted with engine one. So, you could call this almost an earthquake in that world. So it would be useful to understand what impact engine one had on incentives or otherwise of these exploration and production firms to make these net zero type pledges. So those are the 4 things we study. Again, the research is very preliminary, and as I said, this is a continuously evolving space. So I just wanted to kind of put that out as a caveat. For folks who care about details and tables, I'm just going to flash a very, very quick table here. So our sample effectively consists of 57 companies. And there's some good variation. 18 announced that they would go net zero. 23 announced some kind of carbon reduction, and the other 16 effectively do nothing. There's some nice variation statistically, at least, to try and understand what might distinguish one kind of firm from the other. And again, I don't want to intimidate you with regressions and so on. So if you may just focus on that red box here. So these are the key takeaways, Twitter style. Who pledges? Large firms tend to pledge, which makes sense because decarbonization is an expensive fixed cost type endeavor. Firms with more gas-based revenues as opposed to oil-based revenues are at least statistically more likely to pledge. And what's the story here? Because gas, as you know, is seen as a transitional fuel compared to oil. So it's a bit easier for these gas-based companies to go and pledge a reduction. Remarkably, the BlackRock results kind of interesting. If BlackRock owns more of your company, then the probability that you pledge is higher, which is fascinating. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of Larry Fink's letters and BlackRock's consistent advocacy for climate disclosure and pushing companies to take some responsibility for climate. So it's kind of cool to see this in the data. And post engine number one. So after engine number one gets involved, the statistical probability of an exploration and production company pledging seems to go up quite a lot. So these are reasonable results. They make some sense, which I'm happy about, because as an empiricist, I'm happy to find anything in the data, because archival data tends to be very noisy. I mean, unlike Vanessa, who can run experiments and keep things tight, we take the data as it comes to us in the real world, and we have to worry about all kinds of confounds and sources of noise that we should do our best to clean up. So let's look at the stock price reaction idea a little bit. So again, pinning a date down was kind of difficult, and the whole idea behind the stock price reaction test is you need to know exactly when the announcement was made. And the thinking is that in efficient markets, if this is new information, this should move the price, controlling for other reasons why prices move, such as the market changes overall, oil prices move. So subject to all those controls, can we look for some kind of a heartbeat in the capital markets when these announcements are made? And again, we publish the list here of the firms that we look at. There's a tiny positive stock price reaction when a net zero announcement is made, but there is nothing when firms announce that they would reduce emissions. So net zero, tiny positive. When you make an announcement reducing emissions, nothing. But again, you have to be careful, because as I said earlier, the data comes to us. We don't run randomized experiments. So it turns out a number of these net zero announcements were made concurrently with an earnings announcement. So from a experimental standpoint, I don't know whether the market is reacting to the earnings announcement or is it reacting to the net zero announcement? So we have one more test where we try to clean this out. So if you control for the idea that some of these announcements are simultaneously bundled or made with an earnings announcement, there's nothing going on for net zero. So which kind of raises, and our R squares, as you can see, are pretty tiny. In some cases, the adjusted R squares are negative. So the big point here being, maybe the market by and large thinks that these net zero announcements are cheap talk. Then we dig a bit deeper, and here we look at the so-called quality of pledges. And here the big picture attempt is to look at, is the board committed to this? Is there a connection between say the CEO compensation and climate? I think the previous speaker mentioned the important role of G. So this pretty much underscores what she was saying. Can we find quantifiable targets? Are you giving us a date by which you're going to be net zero? Are you giving us specific strategies? Is it a methane reduction strategy? Is it are you going to do something about say water? Are you going to cut flaring? So this is where assessing the quality of the pledges, as I mentioned earlier, became quite hard, very hard actually, in terms of the work involved. And there's some tentative evidence that if you put out something that looks like a credible transition plan, and you can think of these as proxies for that. If you have a clear date promised for the emissions, if you have a clear date promised for cutting gas flaring, and if you have some kind of water strategy, there is some statistical association in a positive sense for a net zero announcement, but we don't find a whole lot on the other governance type ideas, partly because if you look at some of these compensation plans linked to ESG, it's like very vague. I mean, climate is one of the 15 things that they are linking the bonus to. Sometimes it's not clear what the dollars at stake are for the CEO. So if you read headlines saying that ESG is being linked to compensation plans, I would urge you to open and look, trust but verify. Go look at the proxy statement, figure out what dollars are at risk, because in my experience, they're usually pretty tiny. And that seems to kind of show up in the stock price results. There's nothing going on really, if with the G angle as much. Final result, the engine one idea. So we look at the around 9 events around the engine one episode. So engine one puts out an open letter. I think I misspoke earlier. That was December 2020, not 21. So you can see the dates on the left on this on the screen. You can see the exact events that we look at. And here we try to understand if there's a stock price reaction to these events among pledgees and non-pledgees, meaning folks who have pledged something, either a net zero or a carbon reduction by that date, compared to a so-called control sample of folks who have not pledged. And is there any difference here? And if you look at that, the 27th of January 21, that's a pretty interesting date, because that was the first slate of directors that engine number one put out. So on that date, it turns out that the non-pledgees, meaning folks who haven't promised anything, suffer a fairly big negative stock price reaction relative to the pledgees. And there is a little bit going on around the other dates as well. So this is quite interesting, So why are the non-pledgees getting hit? Again, we can hypothesize, and we've still not nailed down why, but the stories could be that if you're a pledgee, then you're seen as a better company, or they are thinking that maybe engine one is the beginning of this new activism type, green activism type hedge funds going after companies, and the non-pledgees maybe as you know, are smaller companies, so they don't really have the resources to do this. Or it might be some kind of screening story. These ESG funds tend to screen out folks who are probably not net zero, and maybe that has an implication in terms of liquidity and stock price, although the link there is kind of tenuous. The screening really matter is also a controversial question. So we haven't fully understood why we see that reaction, but it does seem to happen, which is itself, I think, quite interesting. So let me kind of conclude. Lots of words here, but what should you remember after all this? I think there are some interesting statistical patterns that try to help us understand the world. Larger firms tend to pledge. Firms heavy on gas revenue tend to pledge. Firms owned by BlackRock are more likely to pledge, which I think is pretty cool. Post engine number one after December 2020, and especially after that first slate of directors gets put out, companies are more likely to pledge, which is interesting. The average stock price reaction, subject to the nuances I dragged you through, I think is by and large zero, because I don't know whether they're reacting to the earnings announcement or the pledge itself. But there seems to be some positive reaction associated with laying out a specific strategy, a strategy to cut flaring, a specific date to cut emissions, and if you've talked about some kind of strategy to cut freshwater use, especially in the fracking process, there seems to be a weak positive reaction. The engine number one event, I think, is quite interesting, especially around that first date when they put out that slate of directors. The non-pledgees till that point seem to suffer a negative reaction. But surely this is the beginning of a long stream of literature in the area. Some of the more interesting work, I think, in this area is sadly not being done in the scholarly journals. It's more in the NGO space. But the issue with the NGOs is that they have a small list of companies. Jeff is walking up, which must mean I should stop. So I will. Thank you. Questions? Find me on the Columbia website or on the LinkedIn page. And thank you, Jeff, again. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person.
Thanks very much indeed, Shiva. That was great.